He example of my grandfather Varus gave me a good disposition, not prone to anger. 2. By the recollection of my father's character, I learned to be both modest and manly. 3. As for my mother, she taught me to have regard for religion, to be generous and open-handed, and not only to forbear from doing anybody an ill turn, but not so much as to endure the thought of it. By her, likewise, I was bred to a plain, inexpensive way of living, very different from he common luxury of the rich. 4. I have to thank my great-grandfather that I did not go to a public school, but had good masters at home, and learnt to know that one ought to spend liberally on such things. 5. From my governor, I learned not to join either the green or the blue faction on the race ground, nor to support the Parmularius or Scutarius at the gladiators' shows. He taught me also to put my own hand to business upon occasion, to endure hardship and fatigues, and to throw the necessities of nature into a little compass, that I ought not to meddle with other people's business, nor be easy in giving credit to informers. 6. From Diognetus, to shun vain pursuits, not to be led away with the impostures of wizards and soothsayers who pretend they can discharge evil spirits and do strange feats by the strength of a charm, not to keep quails for the pit, nor to be eager after any such thynor. This Diognetus taught me to bear freedom and plain dealing in others and apply myself to philosophy. He also procured me the instruction of Bacchius, Tendasus, and Marcianus. He likewise put me upon improving myself by writing dialogues when I was a boy, prevailed with me to prefer a couch covered with hides to a bed of state, and reconciled me to other like Rio, hours of the Grecian discipline. 7. It was Rusticus that first made me desire to live rightly, and come to a better state, who prevented me from running into the vanity of the sophists, either by writing speculative treatises, haranguing upon moral subjects, or making a fantastical appearance or display of generosity or discipline. This philosopher kept me from yielding to the charms of rhetoric and poetry, from affecting the character of a man of pleasantry, from wearing my senator's robe in the house or anything of this kind which looks like conceit and affectation. He taught me to write letters in a plain, unornamental style, like that dated by him from Cyniessa to my mother. By his instructions I was persuaded to be easily reconciled to those who had misbehaved themselves and disobliged me, as soon as they desired reconciliation. And of the same master, I learned to read an author carefully, not to take up with a superficial view or assent quickly to idle talkers. And to conclude with him, he gave me his own copy of Epictetus's memoirs. 8. Apollonius taught me to give my mind its due freedom and disengage it from dependence upon chance, and not to regard, though ever so little, anything uncountenanced by reason, to maintain an equality of temper, even in acute pains, and loss of children, or tedious sickness. His practice was an excellent instance that a man may be forcible and yet unbend his humor as occasion requires. The heaviness and impertinence of his scholars could seldom rouse his ill temper. As for his learning, and the peculiar happiness of his manner in teaching, he was so far from being proud of himself upon this score, that one might easily perceive he thought it one of the least things which belonged to him. This great man let me into the true secret of receiving an obligation, without either lessening myself or seeming ungrateful to my friend. 9. The philosopher Sextus recommended good humor to me, and showed me the pattern of a household governed in a fatherly manner. He also bade me make nature and reason my rule to live by. By his precedent I was instructed to appear with an unaffected gravity, to study the temper and circumstances of my friends in order to oblige them. I saw him bearing with the ignorant and undiscerning, complacent and obliging to all people, so that his conversation was more charming than flattery, and yet at the same time he was held in the highest reverence by others. Conversing with this philosopher helped me to draw up a true, intelligible, and methodical scheme for life and manners, and never so much as to show the least sign of anger or any other disturbing thought, but to be perfectly calm and indifferent, yet tender-hearted. However, he let me see in himself that a man might show his goodwill significantly enough, without noise and display, and likewise possess great knowledge without vanity and ostentation. 10. Alexander the grammarian taught me not to be ruggedly critical about words, nor find fault with people for improprieties of phrase or pronunciation, but to set them right by speaking the thing properly myself, and that either by way of answer, assent, or inquiry, or by some such other indirect and suitable correction. 11. Fronto taught me that envy, tricking, and dissimulation are the character and consequences of tyranny, and that those we call patricians have commonly not much fatherly feeling in them. 12. Alexander the Platonist advised me that without necessity I should never say to anyone, nor write in a letter, that I am not at leisure, nor make business an excuse to decline frequently the offices of humanity to those we dwell with. 13. I learned of Catullus not to slight a friend for making a remonstrance, though it should happen to be unreasonable, but rather to endeavor to restore him to his natural humor. That, like Domitius and Athenodotus, I should always speak well of those who had the care of my education, and that I should always preserve an hearty affection for my children. 14. I am indebted to Severus for the love I bear to my relations and towards justice and truth. He likewise made me acquainted with the character and sentiments of Cato, Brutus, Thrasea, Helvidius, and Dio, and gave me the idea of an equal commonwealth, with equal rights and equal speech, and also of a monarchy, where the liberty of the subject was principally regarded. To mention some more of my obligations to him, it was of him I learned not to grow wise by starts and sudden fancies, but to be a constant admirer of philosophy and improvement, that a man ought to be generous and obliging, hope the best of matters, and never question the affection of his friends, to be free in showing a reasonable dislike of another, and no less clear in his own expectations and desires, and not to put his friends to the trouble of divining what he would be at. 15. I learned from Maximus to command myself, and not to be too much drawn towards anything, to be full of spirits under sickness and misfortune, to be frugal in his expenses, without minding being lampooned for his pains, not to worship the gods to superstition, not to court the populace, either by prodigality or compliment, but rather to be sober and firm upon all occasions, keeping things in a steady decorum, without chopping and changing of measures, to enjoy the plenty and magnificence of a sovereign fortune without bragging, and yet without making excuse, so as freely to enjoy them when present, but when wanting, not to be mortified at the loss of them, and to behave himself so that no man could charge him with sophistry, or buffooning, or being a pedant. No, he was a person mature and perfect, scorning flattery, and thoroughly qualified to govern himself and others. As for those that were philosophers in earnest, he had a great regard for them, but without reproaching those who were otherwise, nor yet being led away by these. He was condescending and familiar in conversation, and pleasant too, but not to tiresomeness and excess. As for his health, he was not anxious about it, like one fond of living, or over-studious of bodily appearance, and yet managed his constitution with that care as seldom to stand in need of the assistance of pagiasic or outward applications. Farther, he never envied and browbeat those that were eminent in any faculty or science, as eloquence, or knowledge of the laws or morals, but on the contrary, encouraged them in their ways, and promoted their reputation. He observed fitness and custom in all his actions, and yet did not seem to regard them. He was not fickle and fluttering in his humor, but constant both toplace and undertaking, and I have seen him, after violent fits of the headache, return fresh and vigorous to his usual business. He kept but few things to himself, and those were secrets of government. He was very moderate and frugal in shows, public buildings, liberalities, and such like, being one that did not so much regard the popularity as the rightness of an action. It was none of his custom to bathe at unusual hours, or to be overcome with the fancy of building, to study eating and luxury, to value the curiosity of his clothes, or the shape and person of his servants. His cloak came from Laurium, his villa on the coast. At Lanuvium, he wore for the most part only a tunic, and at Tusculum he would scarcely so much as put on a cloak without making an excuse for it. To take him altogether, there was nothing of ruggedness, immodesty, or eagerness in his temper. Neither did he ever seem to drudge and sweat at the and pleasant too, but not to tiresomeness and excess. As for his health, he was not anxious about it like one fond of living or over-studious of bodily appearance, and yet managed his constitution with that care as seldom to stand in need of the assistance of basic or outward applications. Farther, he never envied and browbeat those that were eminent in any faculty or science, as eloquence or knowledge of the laws or morals, but on the contrary, encouraged them in their ways and promoted their reputation. He observed fitness and custom in all his actions, and yet did not seem to regard them. He was not fickle and fluttering in his humor, but constant both topplace and undertaking, and I have seen him, after violent fits of the headache, return fresh and vigorous to his usual business. He kept but few things to himself, and those were secrets of government. He was very moderate and frugal in shows, public buildings, liberalities, and such like, being one that did not so much regard the popularity as the rightness of an action. It was none of his custom to bathe at unusual hours, or to be overcome with the fancy of building, to study eating and luxury, to value the curiosity of his clothes, or the shape and person of his servants. His cloak came from Laurium, his villa on the coast. At Lanuvium, he wore for the most part only a tunic, and at Tusculum he would scarcely so much as put on a cloak without making an excuse for it. To take him altogether, there was nothing of ruggedness, immodesty, or eagerness in his temper. Neither did he ever seem to drudge and sweat at the helm. Things were dispatched at leisure and without being felt, and the administration was carried on without confusion, with great order, force, and uniformity. Upon the whole, what was told of Socrates is applicable to him, for he was so much master of himself that he could either take or leave those conveniences of life with respect to which most people are either uneasy without them or intemperate with them. Now, to hold on with fortitude in one condition and sobriety in the other is a proof of a great soul and an impregnable virtue, such as he showed in the sickness of Maximus. 17. I have to thank the gods that my grandfathers, parents, sister, preceptors, relations, friends, and domestics were almost all of them persons of probity, and that I never happened to disoblige or misbehave myself towards any of them, notwithstanding that my disposition was such that had occasion offered I might have acted thus. But by the goodness of the gods I met with no provocations to reveal my infirmities. It is likewise by their providence that my childhood was no longer managed by my grandfather's mistress, that I preserved the flower of my youth, that I was subject to the emperor my father, and bred under him, who was the most proper person living to put me out of conceit with pride, and to convince me that it is possible to live in a palace without the Siri, money of guards, without richness and distinction of habit, without torches, statues, or such other marks of royalty and state, and that a prince may shrink himself almost into the figure of a private gentleman, and yet act nevertheless with all the force and majesty of his character when the common weal requires it. It is the favor of the gods that I happen to meet with a brother whose behavior and affection is such as to contribute both to my pleasure and improvement. It is also their blessing that my children were neither stupid nor misshapen, that I made no farther advances in rhetoric, poetry, and such other amusements which possibly might have engaged my fancy too far, had I found myself a considerable proficient, that without asking, I gave my governors that share of honor which they seemed to desire, and did not put them off from time to time with promises and excuses, because they were yet but young, that I had the happiness of being acquainted with Apollonius, Rusticus, and Maximus, that I have a clear idea of the life in accordance with nature, and the impression frequently refreshed, so that considering the extraordinary assistance and directions of the gods, it is impossible for me to miss the road of nature, unless by refusing to be guided by the dictates and almost sensible inspirations of heaven. It is by their favor that my constitution has held out so well, under a life of fatigue and business, that I never had to do with Benedicta or Theodotus, and when I fell into some fits of love I was soon cured, that when I fell out with Rusticus, as it frequently happened, I was not transported into any act of violence, that I had the satisfaction of my mother's life and compa, and sucked in again. The third part of your composition is the ruling part. Now consider thus. You are an old man. Do not suffer this noble part of you under servitude any longer. Let it not be moved by the springs of selfish passions. Let it not quarrel with fate, be uneasy at the present, or afraid of the future. 8. Providence shines clearly through the works of the gods. Even the works of chance are not without dependence on nature, being only an effect of that chain of causes which are under a providential regulation. Indeed, all things flow from this fountain. Besides, there is necessity and the interest of the whole universe, of which you are a part. Now, that which is both the product and support of universal nature must by consequence be serviceable to every part of it. But the world subsists upon change, and is preserved by the mutation of the simple elements, and also of things mixed and compounded, and what it loses one way it gets another. Let these reflections satisfy you and make them your rule to live by. As for books, cast away your thirst after them, that you may not die complaining, but go off in good humor, and heartily thank the gods for what you have had. 4. Remember how often you have postponed minding your interest, and let slip those opportunities the gods have given you. It is now high time to consider what sort of world you are part of, and from what kind of governor of it you are descended. That you have a set period assigned you to act in, and unless you improve it to brighten and compose your thoughts, it will quickly run off with you and be lost beyond recovery. 5. Take care always to remember that you are a man and a eomen, and let every action be done with perfect and unaffected gravity, humanity, freedom, and justice. And be sure you entertain no fancies which may give check to these qualities. This is possible if you will but perform every action as though it were your last, if your appetites and passions do not cross upon your reason, if you keep clear of rashness, and have nothing of insincerity and self-love to infect you, and do not complain of your destiny. You see what a few points a man has to gain in order to attain to a godlike way of living, for he that comes thus far performs all which the immortal powers will require of him. 6. Continue to dishonor yourself, my soul. Neither will you have much time left to do yourself honor, for the life of each man is almost up already. And yet, instead of pay, person and is vexed and, as it were, forced into a passion, whereas the other begins with inclination and commits the fault through desire. 11. Manage all your actions, words, and thoughts accordingly, since you may at any moment quit life. And what great matter is the business of dying? If the gods are in being, you can suffer nothing, for they will do you no harm. And if they are not, or take no care of us mortals, why then a world without either gods or providence is not worth a man's while to live in. But in truth, the being of the gods and their concern in human affairs is beyond dispute, and they have put it entirely in a man's power not to fall into any calamity properly so called. And if other misfortunes had been really evils, they would have provided against them too, and furnished man with capacity to avoid them. But how can that which cannot make the man worse make his life so? I can never be persuaded that the universal nature neglected these matters through want of knowledge, or, having that, yet lacked the power to prevent or correct the error, or that nature should commit such a fault through want of power or skill as to suffer things really good and evil to happen promiscuously to good and bad men. Now, living and dying, honor and infamy, pleasure and pain, riches and poverty, all these things are the common allotment of the virtuous and vicious, because they have nothing intrinsically noble or base in their nature, and therefore, to speak properly, are neither good nor bad. 12. Consider how quickly all things are dissolved and resolved, the bodies and substances themselves into the matter and substance of the world, and their memories into its general age and time. Consider, too, the objects of sense, particularly those which charm us with pleasure, frighten us with pain, or are most admired for empty reputation. The power of thought will show a man how insignificant, despicable, and paltry these things are, and how soon they wither and die. It will show him what those people are upon whose fancy and good word the being of fame depends, also the nature of death, which, if once abstracted from the pomp and terror of the idea, will be found nothing more than a pure natural action. Noah that dreads the course of nature is a very child. But this is not only a work of nature, but is also profitable to her. Lastly, we should consider how we are related to the deity, and in what part of our being, and in what condition of that part, engaged in, and what you have had strength to endure, that now your task is done and the history of your life finished. Remember likewise how many fair sights you have seen, how much of pleasure and pain you have despised, how much glory disregarded, and how often you have done good against evil. 32. Why should skill and knowledge be disturbed at the censures of ignorance? But who are these knowing and skillful people? Why, those who are acquainted with the original cause and end of all things, with that reason that pervades the mass of matter, renews the world at certain periods, and governs it through all the lengths of time. 33. You will quickly be reduced to ashes and skeleton, and it may be you will have a name left you, and it may be not. And what is a name? Nothing but sound and echo. And then for those things which are so much valued in the world, they're miserably empty and rotten, and insignificant. It is like puppies snarling for a bone, and the contests of little children sometimes transported, and then again all in tears about a plaything. And as for modesty and good faith, truth and justice, they have fulled up to Olympus from the widespread earth. And now what is it that can keep you here? For if the objects of sense are floating and changeable, and the organs misty and apt to be imposed on, if the soul is but a vapor drawn off the blood, and the applause of little mortals insignificant, if the case stands thus, why not have patience till you are either extinguished or removed? Until that time comes, what is to be done? The answer is easy: to worship the gods and speak honorably of them, to be beneficial to mankind, to bear with them or avoid them, and lastly, to remember that whatever lies without the compass of your own flesh and breath is nothing of yours, nor in your power. 34. You may be always successful if you do but set out well, and let your thoughts and practice proceed upon right method. There are two properties and privileges common to the soul of God and man and all rational beings. The one is, not to be hindered by anything external; the other, to make virtuous intention and action their supreme satisfaction, and not so much as to desire anything farther. 35. If this accident is no fault of mine, nor a consequence of it, and besides, if the community is never the worse for it, why am I concerned? Now how is the community injured? 36. Do not suffer a sudden impression to overbear your judgment. Let those that want your assay, as the substance of the universe is pliable and obedient, so that sovereign reason which gives laws to it has neither motive nor inclination to bring an evil upon anything. It has no evil in its nature, nor does evil, but forms and governs all things, and hurts nothing. 2. Do but your duty, and do not trouble yourself, whether it is in the cold or by a good fire, whether you are overwatched or satisfied with sleep, whether you have a good word or a bad one, whether you are dying or doing anything else. For this last must be done at one time or other. It is part of the business of life to leave it, and here too it suffices to manage the present well. 3. Look thoroughly into matters, and let not the peculiar quality or intrinsic value of anything escape you. 4. The present appearance of things will quickly undergo a change, and be either exhaled into common matter or dispersed. 5. That intelligent being that governs the universe has perfect views of his own nature and acts, and of the matter on which he. The best way of revenge is not to imitate the injury. 7. Be always doing something serviceable to mankind, and let this constant generosity be your only pleasure, not forgetting in the meantime a due regard to the deity. 8. The governing part of the mind arouses and alters itself, gives what air it pleases to its own likeness, and to all the accidents and circumstances without. 9. The particular effects in the world are all wrought by one intelligent nature. This universal cause has no foreign assistant, no interloping principle, either without or within it. 10. The world is either a medley of atoms that now intermingle and now are scattered apart, or else it is a unity under the laws of order and providence. If the first, what should T stay for? Where nature is in such a chaos, and things are so blindly jumbled together. Why do I care for anything else than to return to the element of earth as soon as may be? Why should I give myself any trouble? Let me dow it I will, my elements will be scattered. But if there is a providence, then I adore the great governor of the world, and am easy and of good cheer in the prospect of protection. 11. When you happen to be ruffled a little by any untoward accident, retire immediately into your reason, and do not move out of tune any further than needs must. For the sooner you return to harmony, the more you will get it in your own power. 12. Put the case. 3. Who had a stepmother and a mother at the same time, though you would pay a regard to the first, your converse, I conceive, would be mostly with the latter. Let the court and philosophy represent these two relations to you. Apply frequently to this last, and seek your refreshment with her. For it is a life of virtue and philosophy which makes life at court tolerable to you, and you yourself tolerable. 13. When we have meat before us or other dishes, we receive the impression that this is but the carcass of a fish, this of a fowl, and the other of a pig. And then for this bottle of Falernian, what is it but a little moisture squeezed out of the berry of a grape? And your purple is nothing but sheep's hair twisted together and stained in the gore of a little shellfish. And if we were to proceed to some other satisfactions of sense, we should find them but coarse in their causes and constitution. And as these notions strike through the surface, press into the heart of things and show them in their natural colors, so we should carry them on and apply them to all the pageantry of life. And where things appear most plausible, be sure to bring them to the test and look at their worth. S-ness, and strip them of all the words by which they were exalted. Without this care, figure and appear ants are great cheats, and when you think your fancy is best employed, you will be most fooled. Remember what Crates said even of Xenocrates. 14. The inclination of the generality may be reduced to these heads. Some people are little enough to be attracted by things in the state of bare existence or vegetation, as with stones, wood, figs, grapes, olives, and such like. Others, avo, are somewhat more reasonable in their fancy, must have life to charm them, and these, it may be, are in love with their flocks and herds. A third sort, better furnished than the former, admire nothing beneath a rational soul, and this not as a whole, but as it were they pride themselves in slaves, possessed of some skill, parts, or industry. But he that values a rational creature that is social and universal runs into none of the follies above mentioned, but makes it his chief business. Look to his own soul and keep it in rational and social movements, and to assist all mankind in the public interest. 15. Some things are pressing into being, and others are hastening out of it, and that which was entire just now is part of it spent already. The world is renewed by this change and flux no less than the infinite series of ages by the perpetual succession of time. Now, who would set a value upon things hurried thus fast down the stream, on which it is impossible to stop? Such a passion is much like falling in love with a sparrow flying over your head. You have, as it were, but one glimpse of her, and she is out of sight. Life is but a sort of exhalation of the blood, and a little breathing in of air. Now to inhale and exhale your breath for the support of life, which you do every moment, and expire your last, when you lose the whole power of breathing which you received at your birth yesterday or the day before, is much the same action. When we have meat before us or other dishes, we receive the impression that this is but the carcass of a fish, this of a fowl, and the other of a pig. And then for this bottle of Falernian, what is it but a little moisture squeezed out of the berry of a grape? And your purple is nothing but sheep's hair twisted together and stained in the gore of a little shellfish. And if we were to proceed to some other satisfactions of sense, we should find them but coarse in their causes and constitution. And as these notions strike through the surface, press into the heart of things, and show them in their natural colors, so we should carry them on, and apply them to all the pageant